And the final thing that I wanted to talk about was a few different ethnographic case studies of environmental policy. So let's shift gears a little bit. We've been talking a lot about the US. We've been being very US-centric. I want to talk about a few different other examples. Although before we do that, I want to talk about the term sustainability, because that'll come up a couple times. So you did a reading about sustainability, right? You read about a new USDA sustainability strategy that was released for Southeast Alaska, relating specifically to the Tongass National Forest, as well as other lands, as far as moving away from a strategy of large-scale old-growth logging and to more small-scale old-growth logging, especially related to cultural activities. There's a super long history behind this. When the Tongass Forest was declared, it was declared on lands that had not been really ceded by Tlingit and Haida people, arguably. And so that is actually one of the reasons why you had the formation of what's called the Central Council of the Tlingit and Haida, which is still an active tribal group today. It's also one of the first big land claim cases that was being taken to court, which eventually paved the way for what's called ANTH here in Alaska, which is a huge major law that affects how we do land policy. So then there's a big history to this announcement, and there's been debates from environmentalists to the logging industry to local loggers to larger, broader logging groups, all sorts of different things. Logging's, definitely an important industry out there, but so is tourism. Tourism's a huge industry out there. So is fishing, right? So there's a lot of different things going on with this press release. But I wanted you to read it for a few different reasons, one of which is to see that policy can go both ways, right? It can go more pro-business, more anti-business, or sometimes, as in this case, kind of potentially protecting a piece of land for some kinds of businesses, right? Something that potentially makes some of the fishing groups really happy, because less deforestation hopefully means less erosion, hopefully means the fish stock does better. But potentially other industries in the area or from outside the area, logging groups, might not like this very much. And so it's complex, right? It's not a simple sort of pro-job, anti-job policy, but it's interesting when we talk about policy to look at how things are premised, how they're framed, right? Sustainability is a good example. Sustainability is a term that we increasingly have seen. It's just been insane to me. Certainly sustainability was a term when I was growing up. So when I was in the 90s and early 2000s, you heard sustainable here and there. It's been very intense to me to see just how broadly that term has infiltrated so many different things. Tons and tons of cities and states and federal governments, but also just corporations have sustainability officers and sustainability plans, and that's just kind of everywhere now. It's become this sort of catch-all environmental term. But it's also an interesting concept. It's almost an empty signifier, but not quite. So when we say empty signifier, that's a term we use for it's from linguistic theory, but the idea that a term can sort of mean its relationship to a word and its relationship to what it means. Unless it's something like onomatopoeia, it's an empty signifier by which it can mean all sorts of different things, right? Meow can mean the sound that a cat, or sorry, that's a bad example. Cat can mean a feline, little furry animal, but it can mean a lot of other things if we decided it to. And indeed, sometimes it does mean different things. Empty signifier. In a sense, a lot of words can be empty signifiers, as Thor says, right? All words are made up. But what I'm trying to get at there is that sustainability is an interesting term. It's not that it doesn't have any sort of meaning attached to it, but that it's got kind of a core meaning, which most people agree with, right? The idea of let's take care of things for the future. Let's sustain things, right? It's built into the name, sustainability. But people take it in a lot of different directions, right? Because what needs to be sustained? The way that I sort of heard the term being used a lot when I was a young environmentalist was sort of sustainability as environmental sustainability, meaning let's do agriculture in a way that doesn't wreck the environment. Let's do logging in a way that doesn't wreck things for endangered species, and also sustains the timber for future. But sustainability has increasingly meant a lot of other things. Some corporations talk about corporate sustainability and environmental sustainability in tandem, right? Sort of let's maintain resources, or let's be, good to the environment and good for ourselves and ensure we continue to make a healthy profit. Or you have sort of sustainable development from groups like the World Bank or the UN, and this emphasis on social sustainability, right? That it's working well for the people, however that's defined, as well as the environment. especially since '92 in the Rio conference. A big emphasis on that kind of idea of environmental sustainability and economic sustainability is intertwined. Some people have critiqued that idea. Ego and Brockington wrote a paper called Neoliberal Conservation, where they criticized the idea that we can make politics and policies where everything prospers together and everything gets sustained, or in their case they were saying conserved, right? That something can be both economically profitable and environmentally sustainable, that sometimes we'll have to do trade-offs. Take that for what it's worth, but sustainability is here to stay. It's a prominent term, and it's one that we should grapple with and look at the different ways it gets used, because like a lot of terms in politics, it's a framing term, and sometimes it gets used in ways that I would say are really beneficial and really helpful for the communities, for nature, however we want to define that. And other times sustainability kind of gets used as a front for things that, if we were to look at it in the light of day, we might say, that doesn't sound great. So we got to look at sustainability. It's one of the reasons with laws and policies, you can't just look at the title of it. You need to actually look at the policy itself and see what it's really saying, and then ask yourself, what would that look like? So a good example of this is a famous case study out of Indonesia. This guy, J. Peter Brocious, he's written several times about the Malaysian rainforest crisis with a group of people called the Penan. So I'm going to be drawing a lot on their article, Green Dots, Pink Hearts, Displacing Politics from the Malaysian Rainforest. And what they're basically getting at is the idea of displacing politics, meaning a plan to make sustainable timber was put in place, and in the process, the government sort of got to wipe its hand, got to kind of displace some of the blame for deforestation by saying, look, we're confronting it, right? And in the process, sort of deforestation got to continue to some degree, right? And there was also just a lot of debates and a lot of just people's like inertia, right? There's a certain amount of just activist fatigue. People can only keep going on a movement, sometimes only so much, especially if they're not personally invested. And it was sort of a way of blunting some of that political inertia. So we'll talk about that. But first, a little bit of background. Penan people were originally a nomadic or semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer foraging group living in Brunei, but also in Sarawak regions here, so in Malaysia and Indonesia. And Penan people, as I understand it, and I admit to not being an expert on this one, but from what I understand in different research I've read, Penan people traditionally had an incredibly egalitarian society. That's generally something we see with hunter-gatherer groups, but like definitely here. The idea that when food was harvested, it needed to be very, very much equitably distributed, like painstaking attention to that, as Robert Needham, who did research with them, pointed out. Painstaking attention to that. And up through the 20s and even into the 50s, that hunter-gatherer lifestyle was very much still in play. As the 20th century wore on, a lot of younger people started to pick up a certain degree of farming, and that has continued to this day, sometimes from pressure from outside groups. Government pressure and coercion enforcing, among other things, initiatives of Christian missionary groups, things like that. The group has to some degree Christianized over the years, also to some degree Islamicized over the years. A lot of people still practice the traditional religion, which emphasizes shamanism as a way of curing illness, emphasizes a supreme deity, emphasizes nature as sentient, as I understand it. And so that's Penan people as a hunter-gatherer people that have to some degree transition, some parts of them are transitioning over to agriculture. Traditionally, people eat a lot, they do a lot of hunting, but even more so, they do a lot of gathering, and the kind of dietary staple, the thing that gives by far the most calories, is these sago palms that you find out in the woods and can harvest pulp from. It's really yummy and works well. A nice strong carbohydrate source, among other things. So that is the situation with the Penan people. But their lands, the lands where they have traditionally used, the forests, have been increasingly deforested. Malaysia has essentially the highest deforestation rate of the tropical Southeast Asian countries. Very, very fast deforestation rate. And definitely had so in the 80s and 90s. That came to the attention of various people around the world, partly because of local people doing blockades and things, which has been happening for decades now, but was starting in the 80s, partly because of this dude, what was his name, this Swedish guy? Anyways, some guy came and like lived for like 10 years there, and then started advocating very publicly for them to do blockades and for people to support from different international communities. So you had both local activism movements, and then you also had like an international campaign of people, for example, writing to the Malaysian government about these issues and saying like, oh, leave the Penan alone, like stop messing with their lands, stop messing with the lands of those animals as well, this wildlife. And that was really pushed back on by people like at the time the Prime Minister, who wrote like a public piece that was opposed. This British kid had written in and been like, oh, like you've got to stop this for the wildlife and so forth. And this Prime Minister wrote back, but did so like publicly, like published it, and was basically like the North, right, the prosperous global North, is doing eco-imperialism, right? He would say multiple times in different contexts, right? This sort of like environmental groups are going to come in and tell us what to do as sort of this new form of imperialism, this new form of outsiders controlling our lands. And he also said, it's easy for you to say as countries that have already deforested a lot of your lands, Great Britain, but, we are still trying to make a living, and this helps locals and gives us economic development. And so why don't you sort of keep your own lawn clean, right? Why don't you go focus on issues there and not try to turn us into a zoo, a place of caged off where we don't get to economically develop? It was a pretty strongly worded letter and responses that were made in the media and things like that. So there was a lot of pushback from the Malaysian government. So at the time, their point of view could best be described as rapid resource development, and indeed a lot of other statements from the Malaysian government that are in this piece if you ever want to go read it. It's definitely all gung-ho on log is kind of a key part of developing the economy at that point, despite the huge effects on Penan people. There were big effects from the logging, making it harder to find animals to hunt, making it harder to find sago palms. Obviously, if there's a bunch of deforestation, a bunch of the palms are going to get cut down, even if they're not what's being logged. What's being logged is hardwood that was then being exported, not just locally, but also for a lot of foreign markets, right? It was being used for furniture or different things in a lot of different countries. But in the process, a bunch of sago palm was getting cut down, a bunch of habitat for game species, a bunch of fruit trees, also ancestral graves were being disturbed. It was having a huge effect on people's way of life. So it was pushed back on a lot with global campaigns, but those weren't terribly successful. But then what happened is that the campaigns shifted in a couple of ways. So there was campaigns of global environmentalists seeking to slow down deforestation in tropical rainforests, and they chose to start focusing a lot more heavily. After these critiques from some of the people in the global south, including the Malaysian government, started to focus a lot more on deforestation in the global north, in places like the Pacific Northwest of the US, and doing campaigns there, or in Canada. And so that was one shift that happened. Another shift that happened was a different approach to reducing deforestation in the global south. So you had the Forest Stewardship Council, which was kind of started by logging groups as a way of addressing this issue. But you had the rise of what was basically a certification program for sustainable timber out of Malaysia. So people negotiated between the ITTO, which is like this huge group of logging associations across different tropical countries, environmental NGOs, environmental groups that were protesting this, and then the Malaysian government. And that kind of triangle of interest all got together. Notice that I don't know that the Penan ever had real formal representation there other than the NGOs, which itself is pretty problematic, deeply problematic, if that's the case. But in any case, you had the working out of the forest certification program for sustainable timber that basically, because part of what happened is the environmental groups in places like Britain or the US, instead of trying to pressure the Malaysian government, which obviously wasn't going to budge and was accusing them of being eco-imperialists, they instead put pressure on, let's say, their local city councils or state councils or governments or House of Lords or Congress to stop buying timber from these areas where it was unsustainable, where there was just huge deforestation, like Malaysia. That was having huge effects on the wildlife as well as the people, and that was successful in many cases. They got many governments to start signing up for these, like, what do you call that? Not ban. Not embargo. Boycott. boycotting this timber. So then Malaysia government had to sort of repivot and develop a way of like showing, oh, we're doing more sustainable timber now, and we've got a certification program for the logging companies that are doing it right and not, damaging the environment too much or something. But then what was hard was in the negotiations, right? The negotiations took years and years and years to try to get this certification program off the ground. And sometimes behind the scenes, it was pretty depressing stuff. So one NGO person who was trying to advocate for Penan people was talking to one of the finance people that was involved in this sort of certification development project. And, they're both working on this issue. And the person from the NGO says, how are we going to make sure that, what does sustainable mean, right? We're talking about sustainable timber, but does that mean that it's done in a way that's socially just, that is doesn't harm Penan communities? Is that taken into account? And then the person from the finance organization said, remember, this is a green dot and not a pink heart. Like, we're going to certify the timber with a green dot, showing that it's from an environmentally friendly source. But that doesn't mean that we're being, right? What's the implication there? Sort of like softies for indigenous groups? What a terrible implication, right? But the idea of sort of Penan people and indigenous people as being left out of sustainability, right? So sustainability can be defined very, very narrowly as a sustainable rate of harvest of the trees, or setting aside enough lands that we continue to be able to protect the orangutan population, but still, in a way, leave out human inhabitants of the land. And the question is that sustainability? Obviously, most anthropologists would say no, given our own proclivities, but that's something that we have to think about when we have groups saying, oh, this product is sustainable or this isn't. I think it's good for us all to move towards more sustainable actions. I think it's better, though, if we can keep a broad definition of sustainable, because it's not just the ecosystem, but also the peoples who depend on that ecosystem. And if anything, sustainability can sometimes be used against people if it just becomes an excuse to kick people out of a piece of land that they've been using sustainably. As Brocious says, when we observe in Malaysia's response to the Sarawak campaign is a remarkable fusion of three elements: the immersion of an official rhetoric of sustainable forest management. So the government of Malaysia went from leave us alone, Westerners, we will handle this, and our deforestation is not your problem, to then actively promoting the idea in a lot of government literature of we've been concerned about sustainability from the beginning. We are a sustainable country. We are doing sustainable forestry, which of course is almost a 180, right? But this is how government discourse works sometimes. And then the development of a transnational techno-scientific apparatus to certify timber, right? A certification program that relied on certain ways of measuring how many trees are being harvested, and the evolution of a sophisticated network of Malaysian government ministries and semi-official organizations and international PR firms. So they started promoting this message at the international level so that people would buy their timber again. Charged with this responsibility of countering the campaign against tropical timber. In short, Malaysia's effort to institute the appearance of a certifiable regime of sustainable forest management became an extension of an elaborate PR apparatus focused on dissipating concern about the fate of Malaysia's rainforests, and diverting attention from the political to the technical, right? Diverting attention away from terrible things that were happening or making a moral or political critique of the government to then, let's focus instead on sort of how to solve this in sort of a Nicolan sense, like setting certain kinds of quotas kind of limit, right? And that takes sort of the attention away from the government and what they're doing that may or may not be abusing human rights. So the situation today, unfortunately, as we can see over here, this is Sarawak, where Penan people live. 1973 intact forest, 2010 intact forest. So tremendous amount of forest loss to this day. And the forest loss has continued, unfortunately. So not all policy is created equal. Just because something is called sustainable doesn't necessarily mean it's sustainable. It seems almost cliche to say read the fine print, but as social scientists, that is part of what we need to be doing. On that note, another case study, also a rather depressing one, is from Kathmandu, which you read about, When is Housing an Environmental Problem? It talked about, in that reading, as you know, that there was declines in the well-being of two rivers, hydrologically, amount of water, pollutedness of the water. Two rivers that run through Kathmandu being quite messed up. There's a lot of different factors happening in the 90s that were happening, but one of the factors that people were often attributing it to, so there's 4 things that the government reports typically brought up. For example, one of them was sand mining. Groups were going in there and actually like actively scooping out sand for mining purposes. There was direct discharge of waste, of sewage waste, into the water, which is not good for water, as you can imagine. And then there was also, though, another factor, which was these settlements, big population increase in Kathmandu, and people thus setting up essentially some settlements, right? These informal housing, this non-approved housing, government non-approved housing, these small, very fragile shelters. And that got worked into things in a way where class got really bound up with pollution and nationality and politics. So the government did a bunch of restoration programs and efforts, and people started to accuse the quote-unquote squatters here of being hukumbasi versus sukumbasi, right? So they are people with power as opposed to people with nothing. The idea that these people were just trying to get a government handout or something. People started to, you had people referring to this as like eyesores versus, oh, this should be a place of parks and high-end housing and stuff like that. This idea of sort of people out of place, that these impoverished communities didn't belong there. And even over time, the idea that, oh, those are not actually Nepalese people, those are people from nearby India. Or the idea that, oh, those are actually from the revolutionary, or from the political dissident groups who may or may not have assassinated the royal family. And so eventually, and they were blamed very strongly, even though, right, the entire city, large chunks of people are dumping sewage right in there, they were particularly blamed for like, oh, they don't manage their sewage at all, blah, 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 blah. So this group of people who were sort of socially out of place, viewed as an eyesore, were also seen as sort of an environmental problem, right? That those people don't properly dispose of their waste. Those people are the problem, even though there was a lot of other problems, right? So this is not to say that they weren't polluting. Obviously, small settlements like this, or large settlements like this on the bank of a river could be very polluting, but it's to suggest that there were other things going on, but a lot of the blame got heaped specifically on the poor people by the river, and especially when political and racial and national tensions came up. Eventually, the group was resettled, not entirely of their own choosing, by a group called Lamenti, to quote-unquote eco-friendly housing. And as you recall from the reading, the NGO was quick to point out, like, oh, look, it's like such like a great space, right? It's like these open fields, like rainwater harvesting, stuff like that. But of course, it was like super far outside of the city. So the group of people that were sort of the problem people, one could look at this kind of conspiratorially and say, oh, surprise, surprise, they ended up way on the outskirts of the city, right? So sort of the environment, the implication of Rademacher's piece, I think, is that the environment was being used, if not as a cover, at least as sort of a conjoined narrative of framing by which issues of class were hammered out and people removed, sort of undesirable people, from the perspective of, you know, sort of beautifying the landscape, right? It's sort of forced gentrification on a very extreme scale. So, policy can be a beautiful thing. Policy is one of the reasons why, for example, some of our endangered species still live. Policy is one of the reasons why we don't have lakes catching on fire like they used to. Policy is one of the reasons why we can get together and say, what do we want to do with our fish to make sure that the fish are okay and that we continue to use fish appropriately. So policy can be a beautiful thing and a powerful thing. But it's precisely in that power that as anthropologists, as social scientists, as environmental professionals, we need to be careful and cautious and look at each policy on its own term. Because a concept as powerful as sustainability, a concept as powerful as the environment, can be used both for incredible benefit, but also sometimes for pretty profound harm. So let us be thoughtful stewards as well as good stewards.